So we built a contact form that is able to send data to the server. We're able to validate that data on the server and then send back any results and display those using a handles bar view. Now, this can work for a lot of applications. One of the upsides of doing it this way is that you're always sending back just plain HTML, so it doesn't rely on any sort of JavaScript support on the browser side. However, it always causes a page refresh, which may be an issue for some applications, especially if this form is maybe towards the bottom of a page. So say I would go to the view here, and let's say we add some additional space above this, because this contact form might not be the first thing on the page. So we're going to add a div in here, and we'll give that a height of 100 VH to make it push all our content down. Style, height, 100 VH. Save that, refresh the browser. So now we can see that our form is down toward the bottom. Now maybe I should give this a background of red. We can see that we've got all this extra space, so kind of reflecting maybe some content that you might also have on the page. Now if I hit send, you'll see it does go through, but now every time I hit send, you'll see that it's actually going to the top of the page. And so if your form is at the top of the page, this isn't necessarily a big deal, although it can still be maybe a performance issue because you still have to re-render the entire page. So a lot of times you may not want to do that. You may want to submit the form without having to re-render it. So the way that we're sending back the response right now, we're sending back an entire page. If I change the way that the response is sent back, then I can be a little bit more clever about how I deal with the page refresh. So let's go into our server. We can see the last line of this route for the posting the contact form. Last line here says to render the contact view. Okay, which is why we're getting HTML every time we submit it. We're getting a brand new page. Now, I have a different way that I can send the data back to the browser. So rather than saying let's render an HTML view, let's send it back as JSON, which is short for JavaScript Object Notation. So what I'm going to put in here is all the data that I was sending to the view. So I was telling it to render the contact view with this data. Instead, I'm going to send it back now as a JSON object by just changing it to res JSON data. Now let's try to send the form. Okay, you'll see that what comes back now is a JSON object. You can see that it's got curly braces to start and end it. And you'll see it's got a variety of properties. All of those properties correspond to what we set up here. So you can see there's a title property with the title of the page is valid to say whether or not the form was valid, the name that we entered, the message that we entered, an error for not providing the name, and an error for not providing the message. And we finally have that result. Now let me go back to the page. And let's say I type in a little bit of data, and let's look at what comes back. So if I type in a name here, okay, we can see the name comes back and no name error, right? So now that I have this coming back as a JSON object, I can be more clever about how I update the page. Now, if I just let the form submit, it's always going to be redirecting to this other page, which really, in order to use the JSON data here, I actually need to do the post asynchronously. I need to do the post through JavaScript instead of allowing that post to just be done as the browser default, which is to redirect. Now that I've made it return JSON data, I also need to go make some changes to the form itself. In order to do that, I need to have some front-end JavaScript. So my front-end JavaScript, I'm going to go put into public. I'm going to go to JS. I'm going to go to main.js. Remember, we set this file up previously to be a container for any JavaScript that we would need across our website. But I haven't put anything in there yet. So now I want to put a little bit of code in there to handle the form submission. So remember, we've got jQuery installed already, so I'm going to start with that. So I'm going to create a ready handler to say I want to run some code when the page is ready. Inside of that, we want to say, well, what happens when the form is submitted? I'll need to create some sort of selector to select the form. If we look at the form, we see that we've already given it an ID of contact form. So I can refer to it by that ID, which is what I'm going to use here. So I'm going to say $, and select it by the ID contact form. And then I want to register a handler for when the form is submitted. So I need the event object. And then let's look at the logic that I want to write in response to it. Well, one of the things I need to do first, I do actually want to prevent the form submission. And in fact, I want to prevent the form submission regardless of whether or not the fields are valid in this case, because I'm going to do the form submission differently. I'm going to use Ajax to do the form submission instead of redirecting the page. So I always want to prevent the default in this case. The form is never going to actually be submitted. We'll only send it as an Ajax request. Next thing I need to do is actually get the data from the fields. And there's more than one way I could do this. I could pick out each field one by one and pull all that and build up an object with all the data there. But there's actually an easier utility baked into jQuery. So I say I want to get all of the form data. So I need to refer to the contact form first. And this is contact form. Okay. So that will refer to the form. And there's a special method I can call on the form called Serialize. What Serialize does is it goes ahead and grabs all the values that the user has entered on the form and puts them into one nice string for us. So this form data will now be a string that contains all of the values that the user has entered. That's great. That makes it easy to get all of the form fields. Even if I say have 20 fields, this will get all of them, and we'll get them in the correct way. So now that I have the data, I can actually try to send it to the server. So jQuery has a method called Ajax, and that will let us send Ajax request. It's a wrapper around the XHR objects, which have existed for a long time in the browser to send and receive, originally meant to send and receive XML. But I'm going to use it to send and receive JSON data, which is kind of the current standard. So to use the Ajax method, you can look it up at, if you search for Ajax, you'll see this come up. We actually need to go down to this one, the low-level interface, not these higher ones that are first suggested, not Ajax send, etc. We want to go to the Ajax method. Okay. There's more than one way to call this. The way I'm going to call this is using that second method. Now, the way you invoke this method is a little bit different because it doesn't require a selector. You just start with the Ajax object and call a method on it. So this is actually going to start with $.Ajax. So you remember, most of the time you need to provide a selector for what elements that you're selecting when you're working with jQuery. This is a case where we don't actually need a selector. We're just referring to the jQuery object itself. So I'm going to call a method, that Ajax method, on there. I need to pass in some data to that method, some parameters, and I'm going to use an object to pass that. So I can pass those as named parameters, which I need to provide, which I need in order to be able to provide a lot of different parameters. The only one that you can provide without using the named approach potentially is the URL. All the rest you have to provide as a name. But I'm gonna specify all of them as name parameters to keep this simple. Okay, so I'm going to say our method here, we still want to submit it as a post. I want to have the URL that it's going to. I want to submit that to /contact. Remember, that's the same thing we've set up as the action of our form. I need to specify that the data type that I want back is JSON. So we'll use that in a minute, and that will let us say that when I submit the form using Ajax, I'm expecting a JSON object back. And then I need to provide the data that I want to send to this endpoint. So I'm going to send the form data. So that's my basic setup. That will initiate the request, and it will initiate it without refreshing the page. It'll initiate it also asynchronously, which is what the A in Ajax stands for. Asynchronous. What Ajax stands for is asynchronous JavaScript and XML. Although we usually don't send XML anymore, we just send JSON data back and forth. Right now, this will initiate the request, but won't do anything with the response. So I still need to write some logic to use the response. So in here, I'm going to write .done. I'm going to chain that to the Ajax call. And .done gets called when the request completes. So there I'm going to say, well, let's get the result, the response. I'm going to call that res. You can really call this anything. A lot of times we call this data. I'm going to call it result to kind of make it easier to read. And maybe more reflecting what we're doing on the back end. So here's my response. Now that response is going to come back as JSON, as we saw previously. And I now need to do something with the values that are there. So first thing I want to do is display some of the error messages. So for instance, I want to display the name error underneath the name field. Now you'll notice that I haven't applied any sort of ID to it yet. But I'm going to go ahead and go through this process without changing the HTML. Okay, I could go through and add some additional IDs, and sometimes that's beneficial. But for this particular case, I'm going to actually do this without changing any of the HTML that we already have. So how can I refer to this error field? Well, I can refer to it using a sibling selector because we know that it is after the name input. Similarly, I can refer to the message error because it is a sibling. It is after the message input. So in here, I'm going to say, let's refer to name. I'm going to select name, and then plus, that's the sibling selector, specifically the adjacent sibling selector. I'm going to say I want the text danger that is immediately following the name input. That's good. And then what do I want to do with that? Well, I want to set the content of that div. And I want to set it to the error that we received. So we've got my response value, response object. I'm going to say response.name error. Remember, that's the name that we used in the JSON object that we're sending back. I do want to make sure that it always sets it. So if the name error thing isn't, if there's not that property, it's going to be undefined, which causes some issues. So I want to say, well, if you don't give me an error, let's set it to empty string. So that's my kind of fallback. And I need to do the same thing for the message field as well. So I'm going to again select it by ID, select the message field, and then we want the text danger that is immediately following it. Now I can't select either of these just by using text danger because that would select all of them. So I need to be more specific, and that's where this adjacency selector comes in. So I'm going to say, let's set the HTML there, but this time we're going to set it to result.message error. Again, that's the name we've used on the back end. Okay, so with just those two things in place, let's try to submit the form. Now you'll remember previously when I tried to submit this form, it was scrolling up to the top of the page. Watch what happens when I submit it now. See how it doesn't scroll up to the top of the page because there's not a page refresh happening. We're not being sent back an entire new HTML page. So that's good. So I can get those fields, but what about the other error message that I want to display after the send button? Okay, well, I could do it this way. I could say, let's refer to that output. And remember, looking at the HTML we have here, it's an output tag, and it's in the ID contact form. So I can say specifically I want the ID, the output tag that's inside of the output form. So in here, I need to refer to the form. I'm going to select the form, and then I want the output that is inside of that. Now it's worth noting I can't do the direct descendant with the greater than because it's not directly inside of the form. There's actually a form group tag around it. So to be more general and to handle more different variations of this, I'm going to use the descendant that way, or the more general descendant. Okay, so we need to set the message. And here I might say, well, let's set it to result dot response dot result. Maybe we use that. Let's try to send this again, and there we see our error occurring. Now let's say we fill in the values correctly. So I put in my name, I put in a message. Okay, so it's showing the message sent, but maybe I want that. You'll notice that it's still showing up in red. So what if I want to change that to be green instead? Well, then we need some sort of if else here, right? I need to say if it's valid, then we want to show it in green. If it's not valid, let's show it in red. The other thing I might want to do is give some sort of fallback if this result message isn't there. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to say if the response is valid, I'm going to do one thing, and if it's not valid, I want to do something else. So in this case, where it's successful, I want to say, well, let's add the class text success. And in this case, where it's failed, I want to add the class text danger. Format that real quick. Collapse here. Okay. Now in this case, I might want to say, well, if it's successful, we'll default this message to success. And if it's not successful, then we'll default this message to error. So there we have some fallback values if for whatever reason we don't get a message. Now, let's try this real quick and see if this is operating, because there is still an issue I need to fix. Okay. If I don't fill in the values, it's still fine. If I do fill in both of the values, you'll notice that it's still red. I told it to add text success, but the problem is it still has text danger. So if I inspect that, you'll see that now it has both the text danger and the text success classes. So I need to remember to remove the other class before I add the proper color class. So in here, I need to say, first, let's remove class. So I'm going to remove text danger first, and then add text success if it's successful, versus if it fails, I need to remove text success and add text danger. So I can chain all these things together without selecting the output field multiple times. So if it is successful, we say remove danger, add success, then set the message. If it fails, remove success, add danger, and display the result. And that will ensure that it's always the right color. So danger here, it's red there. Let me fill in a message. Okay, cool, it's green. Remove this, and we're back to red. So great. So now I can submit the form via Ajax, and the page isn't refreshed, which is great. You'll see that it didn't scroll back up to the top of this form. Now, let's go ahead and remove that debug area that I have at the top. I'm going to remove that div from there so we can go back to the contact form as it was. So this works great. But what if there's an error? What if there's an issue where our server is stopped? Maybe it goes offline. Well, then I'd like this to still be able to show the user some sort of useful error message. Okay. So I've hooked up the done handler, but I haven't hooked up a handler for if something goes wrong. Okay. So the handler I need to hook up there is .fail. If we don't hook up the fail handler, then user has no way of knowing that their request failed. Now, the fail handler needs to take a few different inputs, and you can see that on the jQuery documentation. So if I go down here a bit further into the documentation, they show you that done can handle a few different things. Right now we're just taking the data. For the failure, it actually has 3 arguments. So the first one it has is it needs to take the XHR object, the text status, and then also the error thrown. So if there was an exception of some sort, that would catch the exception. That would be the exception. Oftentimes, though, the error thrown is not provided, so we may need to fall back to the text status. All right, so we want to use these things to display an error to the user if something goes wrong. I'm going to do that very similar to how I handled the error case here. I'm going to switch it up a little bit. So I'm going to say when if it does fail, we're going to remove the text success class and add danger. But then what do I want to set the actual output to? Well, first things first, I need to check if there is an error. So if there is an error thrown, then I need to get that error and turn it into a string. So I'm going to call toString on the error if it exists. Otherwise, we're going to fall back to text status. That will give the user some feedback about what went wrong. All right, so let's try this now. Normally when this is failing, we're still getting back a successful response from the server, right? We may be getting back some error messages, but it's still going into the done handler. So I need some way of simulating a problem with the server. Commonly what I'll do is I'll just go change the URL to an invalid URL. So let's say contact 2. That obviously doesn't exist, so any submission to that will fail. Refresh the page, go ahead and set send. You now see that I'm getting not found. That's coming from the fact that we're now getting a 404 error. So great. That gives the user some feedback. Now, it's worth noting that we probably want to do a little bit more than just clearing out the output. I probably also want to set the errors under your name and message to blank. So let me do that real quick. But in this case, there's no response, so I'm just always going to set them to any string. So this way I'm going to clear out both of those errors, the error that goes with the name, the error goes with the message, and then set the contact form according to that. Check it real quick, and we're still getting expected not found. Let me put the URL back to what it should be, and let's refresh and hit send. Cool. We're back to where we were. So always remember to include that failure handler to cover your bases with places where maybe there's a server issue, because otherwise it can be really hard to debug. Next up, let's talk about how we might handle users that don't have JavaScript enabled. Now, you remember one of the changes I made at the beginning of this video was to change our server to return JSON instead of HTML in response to when the form is submitted. And that works fine as long as I'm using Ajax and as long as the user has JavaScript enabled. But what if they have JavaScript disabled? Let's comment out all our code here and bring it back in a minute. And you refresh the page, and now let's try to send the form. We can see what we get back is still that JSON object. So I'd like to introduce a fallback to allow it to switch back to HTML if it's not being sent as an Ajax request. So let's think about how we could do that. I could go back to returning the HTML page here all the time, but then I would break my Ajax. I could leave it as this, and we've got that problem. So I need some sort of if to determine what kind of response I want. So I can do that using a particular header in HTTP called the accept header. The accept header says what sort of response are you willing to accept. And we'll check in here. So we say if request.accepts, I can tell it if it accepts HTML, then let's return HTML. But if it doesn't accept HTML, then I'm going to return it as JSON. So in the normal case, this is going to say by default that it is going to accept HTML. So if I submit the form now, we're going to see what we get back is a nice HTML page. And if I try to initiate as an Ajax request, then I would like it to send back the data as JSON. Now let's give this a try real quick. So let's comment out this code here, hit save, go back to the contact form, and let's try to send it now. Now what we're seeing here is we've got syntax error, unexpected token, less than JSON. Because what's happening is it's still returning HTML. So I put my logic on the server to say, well, let's send back HTML if it allows it, and otherwise we'll send back JSON. The problem is, as it stands right now, it's still sending an accept header to say, yes, I would accept HTML. So we have to tell it that we don't accept HTML. So on the front end, let's look real quick and see what's happening a little bit. I can go to F12 and pull up the network tab, which is up here. I can then send the form and look at what the response that comes back. We can see in here, we can see all the headers. So for instance, we see under response headers, we can see what's being sent back request headers where you can see what's being sent to the server. So in accept, we're sending to the server, we're saying, yes, I would like JSON, or I would like JavaScript, but I'll actually fall back and allow anything. So that's not really what we want. We want to say to the server, I just want JSON and nothing else. Because that's what the server needs to know. It needs to know that you don't accept HTML. Because this says, I accept anything. So in here, we need to add another parameter. I need to change that header to be what I want. So I'm going to add a setting for headers. And the header I want to add is that accept header. So I'm going to say we only accept application /JSON. So I only accept JSON as my only valid response to this. Save this. Go back to the browser. Let's refresh to make sure we're using the new code and hit send. Great, it works. So what we're sending now is that we only accept application JSON, which then our server code is saying, okay, you don't accept HTML, I will give you JSON. So that way we have a fallback to say, well, if the JavaScript on the front end isn't working for whatever reason, we can still submit the form normally. And that's really the end of this process here. You've now seen how to use Ajax to send data to the server and how to use that response that comes back, whether it is successful in your done handler or failed in your fail handler. And just a reminder, you should always have both of those. You should always have a done handler that does something if it's successful. You should always have a fail handler for when it fails. You can kind of think of these as maybe your try catch. You always want to have a catch statement. So that's the end of it today. I'll see you again in the next video.